Yeah, we're Matt and Freyja, setting up a One Planet development in Tinton, just 5 miles away. So we've got planning permission to do that, and we're in the just pre-building. So this talk's really for people who are thinking about it, or maybe in the stages of applying, or if we're just interested. So has anyone got an OPD in the audience? Is anyone doing it or knows a bit about it? Just a couple of little bits. Okay, so we'll go into some detail. Yeah? We'll go into some detail and we'll explain what we've done already. And we'll take questions at the end. If there's anything burning during the talk, do just put your hand up as well. We can just dive in.
Yeah, so the One Planet Development Policy is part of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, or it came in at the same sort of time, which is a policy that came in about 2010, pioneered by, I think it was proposed by Jane Davidson, who's giving a talk here tomorrow. So there you are. Congratulations, thank you so much. You're making a huge difference. So this is a policy for setting up low-impact smallholdings, typically off-grid smallholdings in the open countryside in Wales. There are, at last count, 45 approved applications. I think we were like the 43rd or something. We're the first one in Monmouthshire. And there are other ways for people to live low impact off the land. I think prior to One Planet Development, there was something known as Policy 52. Some of you might have heard of Llamas in West Wales, who pioneered that. And One Planet Development came out of that. So what we're going to do here today is kind of talk through the details of what's required to make an application. And for anyone who's thinking about doing that, we'll give you the kind of pros and cons of choosing to do this route of application. This is, at the moment, limited to Wales only. There are similar-ish policies currently in Dartmoor and Cornwall. For anyone who wants more information on those sorts of things, go and see Pete Linnell. Pete is sat at the back at the moment. So Pete is running the Grow Your Own Home stall, which is sort of opposite the kids area, opposite the solar library. And he'll be there all weekend. And lots of information on all of these planning policies and ways for being able to live in a low-impact way. Do you want to talk about why?
Yeah, so in terms of why, obviously it's Welsh planning policy, but it means that we have like a living countryside. People will be living and working in the same place and not commuting. It's about ecological regeneration. It's about reducing the amount of energy that we need and having sustainable construction. So it's a lot of things all tied up in one. But obviously I feel like we're speaking in front of Jane. I'm like, you know the background.
Yeah.
So yeah, questions can go to you too. So yeah, in terms of the requirements, there are lots of different small requirements in the policy, but we've broken it down to 6 main areas. So we'll go through these in detail. Sorry, speaking to the mic. So that's the buildings must be zero carbon in construction and in use. In general, it must be off-grid. You have to have a business that's land-based that the income covers your basic needs. We'll go into that. You have to grow 65% of your own food on site, and you have to increase biodiversity, and your ecological footprint has to be below a certain amount every year, every moment you're living in that property.
And we'll go into detail on all of these points. There are caveats to everything being said here. There's a lot more detail behind it all, but that's kind of the overview. So we will go through each of those, and we've kind of broken it into 6 requirements. There are numerous other pieces that need to be included in order to do this, but those are the kind of major categories as we see them, but there are different views on that as well. So where can these happen? So in theory, it allows construction of new dwellings in the open countryside. That doesn't mean that they can happen anywhere. It doesn't mean that anywhere in Wales can have One Planet Development. All of the normal planning rules apply about things like visibility, access, all those sorts of things. Those are the 2 kind of killer things that tend to stop people's applications, is either being too visible from public rights of way or not having the appropriate vehicle access to them. So all of those usual rules apply. The only thing that doesn't apply is that you can build these outside of the current development zones. So that's the advantage to the policy. And all of these requirements that Freyja's briefly listed off there, and we'll go into more detail on, those are basically you take up those commitments in your life in exchange for that ability to build outside the development zone. So There are varying approaches to doing this. We're obviously a small family, and so far, all of the existing applications so far are really kind of couples, small families, some individuals doing it as well. When this policy was developed, I believe the intention was to allow for communities as well. At the moment, there is one example of a group application, but they were actually 4 individual families who kind of split the land legally and then made their own individual homes that way. So thus far, there haven't been any community-type applications. And I think possibly that's to do with there's a lot of time investment, a lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy involved in getting to this stage of being able to complete it. I think we haven't actually clarified here also that we are 3.5 years into our journey. We have permission, but we haven't actually moved onto the site yet. So, to give you a sense of scale, we expect to be moving in about 2027. So, it's a long process. Yeah, it's a long process. Some people will get permission and move on straight away. So there are different ways of doing it. We're taking a kind of more methodical approach to it, but it works for us, and there are different ways of doing it. So in terms of size, they range from, I think the smallest one ever approved was about 2.1 acres, but the majority of them are under 10 acres. I think 2/3 of them actually are under 10 acres in size. There was a report released last year, or maybe this year. Pete's got some copies of that, actually, the One Planet Council report on existing One Planet developments, and in that report they identified that 2/3 of these are under 10 acres in size, so they can be quite small. We're on 4.5 acres, which is a fairly typical size, but they can be very big as well. They don't have to look like any one particular thing. What is important in terms of choosing a site is that they do have reasonable transport links, or either that or you can minimize your own use of transport, so that can be a bit of a confusing area because you can be in the open countryside, but you still need to be able to reduce your reliance on private transport as well.
We thought that doing a talk with a 1-year-old was fine. He's great, but I don't know. I'm not sure what he's thinking. So, where have we got to? So if I do...
Go into buildings?
Yeah, so if I start one of the 6 main points, so the things that we've had to cover, and this is the things you're required to do in order to get planning permission. So number 1 was the zero carbon buildings. So for this, we're doing a timber frame building, so just a small cottage with straw bale infill. And so the outside of the walls are lime rendered, and the inside will either be clay or lime again. Super thick insulation on the roof. Interestingly, since we made that design with really good insulation, building regs have actually changed in the time that we've been applying, so we have to make that insulation even thicker. So it's quite interesting to see policy changing as we go along this journey. So the building must be zero carbon in use. So for that, it'll be a wood burner, so we're going to have over 1 acre of coppice. So we've planted a whole lot of different trees, so a mix of sort of hazel. There is some sycamore and I'm just trying to think Italian alder. We've got
short rotation and long rotation coppice, but this is one of the things when you're thinking about the size of the plot, you need to make sure you've got a big enough plot to be able to cover all your energy needs, and that means covering any, if you're going to use wood fuel as a regenerative coppice source, then you need to make sure you've got enough space for that. I think often I see people sizing their plots based on the size of what they need to grow food, but you've got to think about your energy as well, because that can be a major contributor to the size of your plot.
Yeah, and so in terms of use then, so the energy we're going to use is also going to be solar panels. So in the summer that should be covering the electricity we need adequately, and we'll spec them so that we have a small amount of electricity in the winter just to keep the lights on and to keep a freezer going to store our food. But yeah, space heating. So like Fergal was talking about, like the main things that we require will all be done on wood. And I'm just trying to think, in terms of the coppice we planted, we tried to think forwards about adaptation for climate change. So a couple of the species aren't necessarily typical for the area, but we worked with the AONB, so we're within an area of outstanding natural beauty, and checked in with them. We sort of suggested some species alongside a woodland management consultant. So we'll see how they grow. It's all going to be a bit of a learning curve, and we'll see what happens in terms of the climate changing.
Picking up on the AONB point, I think some people feel that you should avoid being in national parks or in AONBs, but actually, I mean, we've been working quite closely with the AONB in the Wye Valley, and they see it as a really positive thing because they have the same housing development targets as anywhere else, and if you can actually build something which is sympathetic to the landscape, regenerating the landscape at the same time, and providing work and employment for people in the open countryside, it actually fits quite well in those areas as well. So there are several examples now, I think probably 4 or 5 maybe, at least, of one planet developments in the open countryside. Sorry, in AONBs. Should I talk about the off-grid nature of it?
Yeah.
Okay. So they aren't. Not all one planet developments are off-grid. Typically they are, and by off-grid I mean, so in our case we will be off-grid for our water. We have a borehole for that. We will be off-grid for our electricity, that's solar panels. Heating in the winter is the coppice we've spoken of, and also for waste as well. So all of those things would typically be off-grid. If you are close enough to an existing water main, then you can make the case that maybe it would be more ecologically sound to connect to that rather than to create a whole new system of infrastructure. So there are different ways of doing it in that respect as well. So you've gone through the electricity and the heating things. We've talked. Oh yeah, one of the things that's really, very important to say for when you're calculating all of these things, your application has to go in a lot of detail on how you're going to meet the requirements of your dwelling. So you have to start by calculating what am I likely to be using in terms of my water use, electricity use, and so on, and then matching that against what you've actually able to produce on site as well. One of the challenges we found with, particularly with wood fuel, is that I'm sure the planners would love to see nicely balanced calculations with all the numbers. Coppice fuel, it's very hard to find actual concrete figures for, other than we found sweet chestnut, willow, and poplar. But outside of those three species, even hazel, which has been coppiced for centuries, probably far longer here. There's no published figures for that, so it's quite difficult sometimes. You've got to match this paperwork requirement to the kind of rule of thumb that a lot of people would have used in the past to work out how big should I be, allowing my coppice to be. So there is a lot of paperwork involved in this process, and we don't want to kind of give any illusion that's not the case. It does take a lot of that.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about food?
Yeah, I'll just go back to something. So I think because I was juggling kayaks, in terms of like the construction of the house, it doesn't mean you can't use power tools to make it. So I think some people hear about the policy and think, oh, can you use nails and screws? So that we're thinking like the larger scale stuff and the ongoing systems that need to be sustainable, but we need to make it achievable as well. So yeah, it's fine to use power tools. And in terms of the fiddliness of we're building a building that needs building regs, but if someone uses something that's under the Caravan Act, it wouldn't come under that, and actually it then wouldn't come under that bit of the policy.
Yeah, the zero carbon requirement applies only to buildings that require building regulations. I mean, it's typically expected that you would apply the same ethos to the entire site, but I think that means that caravans, I think that's a kind of grey area actually. I'm not quite sure whether Caravan Act buildings require to be zero carbon or not. Maybe Jane will know the answer. I don't know. Anyway.
And a really useful resource we found was the University of Bath actually have produced a database of how much energy is stored within lots of different materials. So for this project, there's just so much researching and reading little bits and bobs, but it's so interesting the amount of resources that are out there. So that's the zero carbon buildings and being off grid in general. In terms of food, so growing 65% of our food on site. So actually, when that's broken down, it is just the first 30% that has to definitely be grown on site. There is a leeway of 35%, which could be made up from the business. So it's all about growing and rearing stuff on that site. But if you only grow 30%, you could make some of it up from the business.
From sale,
from the extra sales. So you have to have made a product and then sold it on to have that profit to use.
Which brings us onto the business.
Yeah. Oh, what else in terms of food? So we do have an annual veg bed, but mostly we're going for perennials, like orchards, plums, all sorts. We're choosing to have chickens and ducks. Some people choose to have more livestock. Some people choose to do it vegan. So where the policy can be implemented in a number of different ways.
I would say it's also measured 65% in terms of value. I don't think that's specified exactly in the policy, but the majority of small holdings set up under the scheme, they measure the 65% by actual cash value. So you look at the value of the things that you are buying, you look at the value of the things you're producing, and you make sure that you're producing at least 30%, but ideally at least 65% of that by value. I have also seen it done by calories. That seems like quite a complicated thing to have to work out all the time, but if you can get the calorie factor conversion between those things, you could do it that way as well. As you can see, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and I feel like it's there for a good reason. It is quite overbearing in terms of the amount of paperwork involved, but once you get your head around what's required, break it down into a series of mini projects almost, it becomes, it's doable. It's there for a reason.
Yeah, and I think we've realised with the paperwork that every single decision we make for it is something we'd have had to decide at some point, but it's just making us decide it up front.
Yeah.
So and in a way, we actually then feel more confident that we know the project's going to work. So sometimes we're like, oh no, why are they asking me about this? The pipe's underground. And it's like, well, we need to know, and we need to know that fits into the rest of it.
Yeah. Yeah, you go into when you finally got an approved plan. I mean, at least in our case, we felt confident that this is going to work and we're never going to miss our targets. And that rigor and that scrutiny actually does help. So I'm actually happy that it's gone down that way. Shall I talk about the business? Because you mentioned the business. So one of the parts of this is that there has to be some kind of enterprise from the site itself. Now, the amount of money you have to make from that is quite small. It's what's called your minimum needs from the site. Now, minimum needs are defined strictly in the policy. It's clothing, computers and IT, phones, travel, and
The rest of your food.
council tax, and any food you haven't made up to that 65% we said before. So those are the 6 categories of things which it comes under. Footwear comes under clothing as well. For us, I think it probably came to about maybe 3,800, and now it's probably gone up because of inflation, but something in the region. If you're looking at making an application now for a small family, it's going to be about £4,000 to £5,000 is what you need to make in profit per year from your business. Now, that can't be... it has to be something that is either grown or reared on site. So typically you're producing something from the site. It can't be a glamping site, for example. It can't be offering therapies on your land. It has to be something where you're actually making something physically and selling it. And that, I think, is really important that you think about that up front as well. So in our case, we make hedgerow wines. So we make Tabery wine, we make oak leaf wine, nettle wine. So wines without grapes in. We do cider. Well, we haven't started doing cider yet, but we've started doing the wines already. And we will be selling mushroom logs. We'll be selling coppice products as well. So it's good to have a few different revenue streams just to show resilience, because if you just show the one, there's could be question marks over whether that can survive into the future as well. But it's also important to think about, if you're thinking about what your business plan is going to be. We didn't go into this deciding, hey, we want to be winemakers, but we already made wine as a hobby. And it seemed to make a lot of sense to us. It's a value-added product. So if you were trying to compete on a typical agricultural market in a small scale, that can be quite difficult to do because there's economies of scale. Larger farmers can clearly do things with more efficiency than a small-scale thing can do. In the case of Taberys, particularly, they're something which you can only really... You don't buy Taberys in the shop, and the reason is they go off as soon as you pick them. So they make an excellent product for making a wine, which is why we were like, okay, let's do that. And we can make a kind of artisan product and sell it at a decent rate. So.
Yeah, but there's a whole range of businesses that people do, and that's what's really exciting, is that it's seeing all the different ways it's implemented. And what's really exciting about living in Wales then, like regenerative food networks, and there's support for it in terms of, there's a couple of organisations set up by the Welsh Government that help in different ways with a bit of advice around the business, particularly food and drink new business startups. So
Business Wales, so if you're in the process of putting an application together, contact Business Wales. They're really, really supportive. They gave us funding, it was from them, wasn't it, for... No, was it Business Wales, for setting up our branding for our packaging, so that was really, really good. And 025, now that's spelled ZERO 2 FIVE. They have a lot of advice as well. That's more around food and drink, but obviously a lot of OPDs are doing food and drink. OPD, by the way, is One Planet Development. Most people tend to refer to it like that.
Sorry, we talk about it so much.
Yeah. Okay, so the next one was the biodiversity increase. So the biodiversity must increase on site. Now, typically we think of development as being something which is destructive. So this is quite radical in a way that the presence of humans on site has to increase biodiversity. So it kind of depends on where you're starting from on your site. If you're looking at a site that is already ancient woodland, I would say you'd be very, very careful. You're probably unlikely to be able to improve that much. Open fields are a lot easier to improve in terms of biodiversity. It's not entirely clear what is meant by biodiversity increase, because you could talk, is it the number of species or is it the density of the species themselves? But what you would need to have done early on in the process is what's called a phase 1 ecological survey. And that's done by an accredited ecologist. That is the only survey that you need to really go externally for. Some people will pay a lot of professionals to get lots of extra surveys and things done on the land beforehand. That so far has been the only thing we've had to do professionally, get somebody else to paid for, and that was about £500, I think. So biodiversity must increase, and you must show how that's going to happen over time. So in the case of us, we're planting traditional orchards, wetland, new hedgerows, coppice. It's quite clear that is going to increase from what was previously just more or less an empty field. Of course, nothing's empty, but yeah.
No, so there was a few species, but it was quite degraded, so it was just semi-improved grassland. But yeah, what's really nice here is that once you get that report back, you can then use that to really inform the design of the site. And the design of the site takes quite a long time. It's really thinking about I guess it's like the local climate and the species we've got on site. So we've got a border around the edge, which had slightly more species. So that's the area we've left as like a wildlife border. And then the management of that will be encouraging species there too. So keeping down the bracken, keeping down the brambles, and bits like that. So yeah, that's biodiversity. But we had like dormouse evidence at the edge of the site, which is really exciting. So in terms of our hazel coppice, we can coppice it on a cycle that means that they get the nuts at a certain point. And when you cut a cant, we can cut around the edge of it first and make sure there's time for any dormice to move. It's the right time of year and things like that. Yeah. So everything informs the next step, which is
having kind of high biodiversity on site is not a bad thing in the outset. Some people think, I've got to have nothing on here to start with. That's not true. You can work with it. I've heard of one where they had some kind of rare butterfly. I don't know where this is or who it was, but they were like, it's a killer. We can't build anything here. And actually they ended up creating essentially a butterfly sanctuary and working with it and improving it. So it's not necessarily a killer, but it is important if you're thinking of doing this, getting an ecological survey early on, because that does dictate the likelihood of you being able to actually get permission on it.
Yeah, and I think there's something about if there's a bit more space on the site, like living sensitively with the ecology of that site becomes easier then. I think the smaller sites, if there is sort of species richness there, it makes it a little bit trickier to build the elements in a way that really facilitates that. Or it depends.
Most of the human elements are going to be actually complementary to nature. It's only really the buildings themselves that lead to absolute destruction of a piece of land. Everything else really is, typically fine. Yeah,
and even then we're like adding in bat boxes and things like that. But that is actually typical for most developments, the things that we were requested. And that's really exciting when you realise how valued the ecology is in terms of any new development. And again, it means there's a lot of thinking that goes into it, but the design at the end really does feel light touch then.
But it does seem like, since we've been doing this, there are more things becoming mainstream. So some of the elements of One Planet development are making their way into the mainstream and becoming a requirement for everyone. So I wonder if in time, everything that you have to do here will just become the norm for everyone. We'll see. Maybe we'll let him wander for a bit. I'm going to talk next about the ecological footprint. So this can seem to many people the most kind of burdensome part of the whole thing. So brace yourselves. You have to keep your ecological footprint to within what is typically about a third of the national average. Now, I'm sure many people here, if you're here, you're probably already living quite a low impact life anyway, or moving towards that, which is great. It is clearly defined in the policy as now there's something called global hectares is the unit of measurement that's used in One Planet development. That can cause a lot of confusion because although it relates to space, it doesn't mean you need to have 2.4 hectares on your land. So I will briefly explain what global hectares is and then try to forget about it entirely as a spatial unit. Think of it as carbon credits. So if you were to take the entire bioproductive land of planet Earth and divide it by the number of people on the planet back in 2010, it comes to a figure of about 2.4 hectares per person on the planet. And that is, it's not, 1.88 in fact is the correct number. But the policy allows for 2.4. So there's 1.88 hectares per person on planet Earth that you would draw all of your resources from, whether that be fuel for your car or food or everything that you're drawing in. So it's about 3 times roughly the average person would be using beyond that, and you're required to keep it below 2.4. So there's a bit more leeway than it being exactly the One Planet footprint. The way we actually measure that is through money. So there are many ways you could measure it. There's a lot of different systems for measuring impact of ecological footprints. But it's done through money. So the idea is that if you don't spend money, you're not causing any degradation to the environment. There is no system for carbon balancing or carbon offsetting with this. It's all anything you do is negative. You can't make a positive towards it. But within a year, you basically need to look at all the transactions you've made out of your bank account, categorize them. There are 76 categories in the policy, and each of those categories has a conversion factor between pound sterling and this carbon credits, I'm going to call it from now on, factor. And so that can be quite an onerous task. If you get your spreadsheet set up nicely, you can kind of get it to automate more or less, but you need to track everything you're spending forever, for the rest of your lives, and submit a report once a year which basically says how much you've actually spent in terms of carbon. So that is the most onerous of the lot, and that in practice means you're unlikely to be able to ever fly abroad, for example. within reason. There's no absolutes in any of this, so it's a balancing game. So I have heard of people doing one planet developments who can take a holiday abroad once a year, but they have to maybe cut back in other areas. So the categories, to give you some examples, there might be for travel, there'll be rail travel, air travel. For the food is broken down into baked things and grains. There's basically a lot of different categories. So the monitoring, so I talked about how you have a yearly monitoring report. So typically these one planet developments have 5 years from a particular date to get started. You carry on, yeah. So the start date is 5 years. In some cases it's 5 years from when you start work on the site. In some cases it's 5 years from when you move in. That's kind of dictated by the local authority, so you might want to clarify that up front if you're intending on moving on straight away. But you have 5 years to be able to meet all these targets we've just spoken about. So that's the zero carbon buildings, getting everything off grid, your food requirements, your business, the biodiversity, and the carbon footprint side of it. Monitoring goes on forever. This isn't something that you just play at for a few years. Yeah. Do you want to take over?
Yeah, I can explain it a little bit. So the monitoring keeps on going. So if every year you live in that dwelling, oh, little chap. Oh dear. And so if you sold the property to someone else, they would need to make a new management plan, and then you'd have a report that goes in every year according to that management plan. And it goes to the local authority, and then they just check through that you've met all your essential criteria. There is like a yellow and a red card system, so if you didn't meet the same point, if there was something that was critically required, and 1 year you weren't meeting it, and then you didn't improve, and then the next year again, like it wasn't met, at that point you would then trigger the exit strategy and you would no longer have planning permission, so you'd have to move off site. And what we've written into the plan is like the exit strategy, the idea is that you take the site back to what it was before the development was there. In some situations, people have written in that the building could be used agriculturally instead. So maybe the house could be, you could take out the fittings and make it used as a shed for animals, or like a woodshed, but it really depends. So yeah, I think so for ours it would be that it would be reused. For all the effort that goes into it, it would be a shame that wasn't then used, but the idea is that the site isn't degraded at all by this development, and it's light touch, so the materials would all either be recycled or could be composted. So it's I mean, it has to be really strict, and it has to be really rigorous to make sure that actually the developments that are put in place are the best for the ecology, and actually for Wales, like for Wales overall. I think I might go and maybe he'll be more settled with me.
Sorry, where did we get to?
So I just said about monitoring.
Okay, all right. So we'll talk next about our experience of actually doing this. So it is a very bureaucratic process. It is a very technical process. It takes a very long time. Some people, I think we're probably one of the more slower examples. We've been very methodical about the whole process, but it is going to be slow regardless. So it's not a quick way to get off grid. But when you're there, in theory, you're set up and you're there confidently, which is nice. It does require some funds up front. It's not like there are no grants or handouts for this, so you do require enough money to be able to build your own home. But it does have you're not paying as much for land in the first place, because this is agricultural land that would not otherwise be subject to planning permission. So it does have a financial advantage as well. So there are benefits in that respect. Some advice, I guess. We've got history giving any advice on this. So in our case, it's very hard to give this advice to everybody who wants to do this. But in our case, we've done it where we already live. And that has very helped massively. We've had loads and loads of support in our development. We've had no objections whatsoever. And I think a lot of One Planet developments do get a lot of objections. And so I think sometimes just off-grid is seen as a dirty word, and people get all these kind of associations with being off-grid. So hopefully as more and more of these appear, it will start to become more mainstream, which would be great. And there's not really a lot of other ways for people to do off-grid on the mainstream. I mean, anyone could, of course, make their house off-grid, I think. But why would you if you're already set up? People don't necessarily take the leap to actually do that. So this is a really excellent policy for actually creating these and normalizing it a bit more, which is nice. Another thing as well, in terms of avoiding complaints, I think is just to be really transparent from the outset. So we've been really clear with all of our neighbours and everything we've been doing, and it just avoids any kind of question marks over, what is it they're doing on that land, So I think just being really, really transparent It's worked for us, but I think everyone's mileage will vary a little bit. Maybe we've got quite lucky as well in that respect. So we're going to talk a bit about actually finding land. Is there anyone here who's actually looking for land at the moment for a One Planet development? Okay, all right. So I'm going to go through a list of the things which we think are important for you to check on a piece of land before you start going for it. Because there are a lot of kind of gotchas, and we put together a checklist of things that you would need to check for on that. So maybe that only applies to you. But okay, so first thing is, if you're looking for a piece of land, check that it hasn't got an uplift clause. So an uplift clause is sometimes known as a clawback clause. There's another word for it as well. I've forgotten the name now. But anyway, these clauses are overage. That's it. It's called an overage clause. That is a clause in the sale, which means that if you increase the value of that land at any point in the future, you owe a proportion of that increase in value back to the original owner. Now that's obviously untenable on a One Planet development because you're bound to increase the value of the land. Second thing to check for is something called Article 4 directions. Now these are particular stipulations placed on the land by the local authority. You get that by doing what's called a local authority search. If anyone wants us to go back to this list after we talk, feel free to come and find us. Check what's called the Magic Map and Land Map. These are the UK government's different maps for looking at suitability of land for various things. Just check all the layers and just check that there's nothing on there that looks like you're in a floodplain or anything bizarre like that. So you want to check that out for sure. Magic Map. These are capital MAGIC, and Land Map is again capital LANDMAP. I think one's for England, one's for Wales, because we're right on the border. They kind of both apply to us. But if you're deeper into Wales, I think it's Magic Map. Yeah. Okay. Also check the council's local development plan, because councils have their own specific set of, I would say, wish list for local development. And I don't think they're able to explicitly prevent One Planet developments, but if there's something on there saying we don't want them, it might be that it's not the place for you to go. It might be better to find somewhere where there's less hostility to it. Checking for covenants on the land. So sometimes land will have covenants registered historically going back that say the land shall not be used for this or that or any particular things. Anything can be registered on a land as a covenant. You can get really bizarre ones. You get that by checking with land registry. It costs £3 to do, so do it. I've also heard of areas that are not sites of special scientific interest, but are potential sites of special scientific interest. So you also want to check with the council that there isn't a potential SSSI being put on your land. Finally, if that all passes and you're looking at the land to buy it, then getting a soil test done is going to be important because you're going to be growing some of your own food. That's pretty much inevitable. And you want to check that it is good growing land. And then finally, if that all looks good, then you would go to the ecologist and commission a proper phase 1 ecological survey, like we said earlier on. I've lost our timepiece, so I don't know how we're doing for time, but... Okay, cool. Right, so we're taking questions after this as well. So this is more or less towards the end of our talk now. So in terms of finding land as well, those uplift clauses that I mentioned are quite commonplace now on the market, so it's often better to go by word of mouth to try and find land if you can. As I said, it's easier if you already live in the local area, but if you can base yourself in an area you want to live in, that's a good way of doing it. So that's more or less everything we wanted to cover. I'm sure there were lots of questions, and so we've got a bit of time to chat through things as well now. What I would say is really important to note, the One Planet Council. The One Planet Council is a voluntary organisation of people like us who... it's not an official body. There is no One Planet development body as such. But One Planet Council are typically active on Facebook. We are on Facebook solely to be able to interact with One Planet Council, One Planet development people. And so even if you sign up with Facebook just for this, it's worth it because there's lots and lots of advice on the One Planet Council Facebook page. They hold every year an open week, and this is actually next week. So this year, if you're thinking of doing this, I would very strongly recommend that you go and see some existing One Planet developments. From 9th to 16th of August, so the 9th of August is next Wednesday, it starts. If you go on their website, there's a lot of different ones you can go to. You can see different implementations of this. Obviously, we've spoken about our use case. We're a small family building a straw bale house. Some people will do this under the Caravan Act. So, there's so many ways it can be done, and it's not like our model is the only way of doing it. This was what works for us. Finally, as I said at the beginning, Pete Linnell sat at the back there. He will be, he's giving us a wave. He runs the Grow Your Own Home store, and we'll be talking about One Planet development all weekend, so you can go and chat with him there. And that's opposite the solar library, near the kids area. And Well, that's it. So thank you. And if anyone's got any questions, we will happily take them.